Hi, I'm Sam Williams, and I'm an architectural researcher. Today we're going to look at architecture from a long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and see what these buildings can tell us about the larger story of Star Wars. First up, the Royal Palace of Naboo in the capital city of Theed. Something that's really evident in the Royal Palace of Naboo are the classical Greek motifs, where you see the columns, you have the pediments and entablatures, and it really alludes to the fact that Naboo is a democracy and is referencing one of the earliest known democracies that we have here on Earth. So when taking a look at this, what's glaringly obvious is the resemblance to the Hagia Sophia in Turkey. What's notable about this structure is its use of the pendentive domes. And what a pendentive dome is essentially a series of half-circle domes that are enclosing and supporting a larger dome. And what's really useful with this strategy is that typically we see the triangle as the strongest structural form, and the dome is also usually ranking high up there. This strategy just combines both of those together. Also of note is this grand processional walkway that leads up to the palace, which alludes to the democracy that exists in this place, where everyone is able to participate right on the steps of this palace. The Royal Palace has a building of a similar height that's just on the other side of this procession. This is very similar to what you see in Washington, D.C., with the White House and a procession that leads to Congress, which is called the People's House, and you have this direct access between the two structures. So what's important about the use of Theed in the Star Wars universe is that it represents an example of a thriving democracy in contrast to what we see with the Empire.
The day we stop believing democracy can work is the day we lose it.
Let's pray that day never comes.
Next, let's jump to Coruscant, which is the capital of both the Republic and the Empire. So Coruscant plays a very outsized role in the Star Wars universe, where it serves as the imperial capital and also the capital of the Republic. So here's what jumps out at me. There is an overwhelmingly large number of very tall buildings that are present throughout this society. We also have this civic building, which is where the Senate meets, and it's a bit lower to the ground, but it's also fairly large in scale. So Coruscant is an example of an ecumenopolis, and what this means is that this is a city-covered planet, and it's very evident here that there is no green, no life, it's just the sky and this urban fabric. And this idea was first popularized by Isaac Asimov. Now, I'm a big fan of cities, and I think what's vital to a healthy city is ample public space and public parks, which this city really has none of. And also everyone is sort of in their own atomized existence, in their private vehicles, flying around, and with not much interaction with each other.
What took us so long?
Oh, you know, Master, I couldn't find a splitter that I really liked.
What I'm reminded of when looking at this is this idea of retrofuturism. It was an idea that was popularized in the 1920s, where we were making a lot of advancements in structural technology. There was a lot of industrialization that was happening and advancements in general in society, and there's a lot of optimism at the time. So it's fairly natural to envision a future in which the entire planet looks like this ideal version of the future. These buildings are very much remind me of the Art Deco style, which was also popular in the 1920s. What's noticeable here is that the buildings seem to step back as they move higher from the ground. A really fun illusion that I notice is that the civic building where the Senate meets is much lower, it's a dome shape, it's closer to the ground and thusly closer to the people, while it's surrounded by these very large, unhumanly scaled structures that are pointing to the economic interests that are competing for power within this universe. So this is in contrast to Naboo, where we see a more equal balance of power, whereas here we see that the economic influence exert a greater influence than a governmental body.
We must persuade the Commerce Guild and the Corporate Alliance to sign the treaty.
What about the senator from Naboo? Is she dead yet?
Next up is the desert planet of Tatooine. So right away I noticed that there are domes being used again here, similar to what we see on Naboo. And also we noticed that the materials here are clearly made from the local earth, like adobe. We also have lots of buttresses that are alluding to more simple construction techniques than what we saw in Coruscant. Also of note is that the buildings are generally similar and uniform in appearance and scale and height, with the exception of some of these buildings back here, which indicates some creep of the Empire. So Tatooine is usually just seen as sort of the edge of the galaxy, a bit rougher, more provincial.
Well, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet that it's farthest from.
I see, sir.
It is somewhat surprising that this does appear to be somewhat planned and organized, despite being a fringe outpost in a galaxy. So the one building we see here that doesn't have a dome reminds me a lot of some military installation. Clearly it has crenellations, it has a modularity that's very different than the rest of what we see on this image. And it reminds me of a lot of a guard tower, just standing high above the city, being able to watch over everything that happens down below. And this is somewhat indicative of the creep of the Empire into this more provincial area where the people are a bit more down to earth and not as involved in the goings-on of the Empire.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
So many of the interior scenes set in Tatooine were actually filmed in North Africa. One of my favorite factoids is that the home in which Luke is raised by his adoptive family, the interior courtyard is filmed inside of an actual example of a Gorfa. So what's cool about Gorfas is that these are multi-story structures with an archway that are made of wood and some of the mud from the area. And this is where you would store grains and food and things like that. But oftentimes, people would also take up residence inside of each of these caverns. Choosing North Africa as a film location may have been an intentional decision, reference the history of colonialism and imperialism that has existed throughout that part of the world, allowing some natural contrast to show between the sort of more provincial buildings and local buildings, and then some of the structures that would exist that's being imposed upon this society by the Empire. Next, let's visit Princess Amidala's home planet of Alderaan. This is also Princess Leia's adoptive home. What I like about Alderaan is that it seems to look more towards the future, and the buildings are a lot more futuristic looking, in contrast to Coruscant, where it sort of references a bygone era. In Alderaan, you see the buildings are generally of the same height and demeanor and design, whereas in Coruscant, you see that there's these huge extreme disparities in the size of the structures and this competing sort of power dynamic that exists between the economic interests and the government. In Alderaan, this is a society where Princess Leia is literally raised in the ivory tower, but so is everyone else. And this also manifests itself in how her mother, Padme, is also a princess and later a queen, but decides to abdicate and become a member of the Senate representing the will of the people. What this reminds me of is towers in the park, which is a concept that was popularized by Le Corbusier. During the heyday of modernism, it was seen as sort of inevitable that cities will continue to grow indefinitely. And of course, it's very unacceptable to have people continue to live in the sort of conditions that we were seeing at the time. So this idea, this Towers and Park idea, was really meant as an anecdote to an overcrowded setting, but while still maintaining a high density. And this idea is that instead of people living in overcrowded slums, which was becoming fairly common at the time, you could sort of organize where people would live and put them in these large buildings surrounded by park space, and the buildings are adequately spaced apart from each other so that you're not breathing down each other's back. So this was another way of thinking about the future of cities, in contrast to what we saw on Coruscant and retrofuturism, which sort of imagined that the city would continually creep and take over the entire planet. And so this version of that idea just gives everyone a lot of breathing room. There's a lot more green space, and the prominent features here, rather than being 100% covered with buildings, is really majoritarily covered with green space. Another feature of this Towers in the Park design is that there's no street frontage, or little to no street frontage. Instead, you're walking through a park to get to your destination. So this sounds fairly idyllic at the time where slums are becoming overcrowded, but today we're starting to see this as sort of anti-urban and very suburban in nature, where people aren't having to interface with each other. It really encouraged single-use spaces where you'll have entire neighborhoods that are only just residential tower blocks, and there's lack of retail and other uses that would enable an active public life. This may be in contrast to what we see in Alderaan, because in this society, all the needs have been met. I would imagine that this is a post-scarcity society where we're no longer having to worry about food resource issues, water, and other ecological concerns. So while Coruscant is meant to be a dystopia, Alderaan is seen as this sort of utopia in contrast. And unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, because this planet does eventually get destroyed by the Death Star, ending its peaceful existence.
No. Alderaan is peaceful. We have no weapons. You can't.
Now let's take a look at another society surrounded by nature, and that's the Ewok villages of Endor. When you first look at this, it's actually sometimes hard to see the villages and the homes here. It sort of blends very seamlessly with the trees as they stick out and are made of a similar material, similar color scheme, and it's sort of camouflage in the background. I do find it kind of sketchy that there's an extensive use of fire in this environment, knowing what happens in forests like this, but it seems to work for them. So what makes the village on Endor very different than Even places like Alderaan, instead of being built on the planet or among the planet, this is made of the planet, where you see that there's not much industrialization involved, and it's really meant to symbolize a symbol existence that the people here enjoy. Unfortunately, this very bucolic place also happens to have the exact resources that the Empire needs to construct their second Death Star. So after Luke destroys the first one, they need to build another one, and they find this planet that has this peaceful sort of existence, and they set up a military installation there, and from that, they begin to exploit and extract the resources from this planet in a way that's very different than the values that are apparent. So whereas we've already seen the Death Star destroy the planet of Alderaan, we see that the Death Star is being used to destroy the planet in a very different way. A theme that's pretty persistent throughout the Star Wars universe is that when we destroy nature, we destroy ourselves. This is manifested in the overall plot line of Anakin Skywalker becoming corrupted by the dark side to become Darth Vader. And notice as he becomes Darth Vader, he slowly replaces his natural organic self with more mechanical machine parts.
He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil.
And this is in contrast to Luke Skywalker, who goes into nature, finds himself, begins training as a Jedi, and eventually proceeds to defeat the dark side.
For my ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Life creates it.
And on that note, let's take a look at the weapon known as the Death Star. The Death Star is both a planet and a weapon. Unlike Coruscant, which is a city that covers a planet, the Death Star is itself entirely man-made.
That's no moon. It's a space station.
It's too big to be a space station.
A prominent feature of the Death Star is this equatorial trench, which circumnavigates the entire planet. And that is where you have your hangar bays, a lot of the defensive uses, the ports, and other ways to access in and out of the entire Death Star. Of course, one of the other really obvious features of the Death Star is this sort of concave bowl, and this is where the Death Star super laser shoots out.
I think it is time we demonstrated the full power of this station.
Now, if you recall in Naboo, we had two dome structures which represented the co-equal branches and division of power in that society. Whereas here, we have two domes that are forming a sphere, with one dome forming the main part of the weapon, where the beam shoots out and destroys planets, and the other side supports it. In a way, it represents the military-industrial complex. You also have these other secondary trenches, which are sort of along these longitudinal lines, and they indicate different sector uses. There are civic uses, there are military personnel, civilians, and also an entire industry to support the construction and development of this weapon that is housed completely within this Death Star.
It's an older code, sir, but it checks out.
I would like to add that inside one of the secondary trenches is where a lot of the aerial battles are played out, but it's also where the main vulnerability of the Death Star existed, and thusly was used to destroy it. So those are the architectural details that I noticed from the various corners of the galaxy in Star Wars. Let me know which series you'd like to see broken down next.